Okay, so we're about to start our first assigned reading, and it's The Functions of School in Modern Society by David Goslin. And so again, we're going to be taking a look at this reading that I think shows some very clear connections to an examination of our education from a functionalist perspective. Okay, so just as a quick reminder from our previous lecture, I hope you remember this table or this image. And what I want you to think about is how our schools are a primary socializing agent, right? We're taking individuals from who have begun the socialization process in their families. And in our schools, one of the goals of schools is one of the manifest goals of schools is to train youth in commitments and capacities. And so remember that the commitments component is about teaching students and helping students internalize particular values and worldviews, like how to interpret the world. And then capacities is about training students skills. And that training should then prepare those youth to become productive members of society and then to fulfill roles in the other social institutions, like the institution of family, the institution of economy, and the institution of polity. So what's your ideal role in those spaces? Our schools are designed to help prepare people to do that. So again, like when we think about the ideal roles, there are norms and values and ideologies that are associated with those different types of roles. And so actually, when I was getting ready for this lecture, it reminded me of a conversation that I was having with my daughter this year. She's a 7th grader, and they read Ayn Rand's book, Anthem, in her English class. And there they were talking about like communism, and then that was like a dominant theme versus capitalism. And she was like, I don't understand why we were learning about that in my English class. And so again, it's like, here's this text that school districts are choosing, or school districts are choosing text that then students read, and they have a shared reading experience, and then they engage in analysis and then a discussion about the values and the plot lines and the characters within those books. And so, she talked about some of the issues in terms of painting that she noticed, like painting communism in a like really bad light, and then that being a point of contrast with like capitalism. And she was basically telling me, like, we talk about how communism is so bad, but then we don't really talk about like what are the bad things that are associated with capitalism. And then she also talked about like the role of women in the art in the book with me, and what their roles and orientations were with other characters within that text. And so again, this is a way of like, when you read text, you talk about values and ideologies and in people's roles and functions, and those things wind up getting internalized and shaping students' worldviews. And I think one of the reasons why my daughter, again, is kind of noticing those types of things is because we do talk about that stuff in our household. I mean, I'm a sociologist, right? So we can't get away from not talking about that stuff. It's part of our like daily living. And so it's a really good point of contrast between like conversations we would have here compared to these texts and the way that they're presenting like economic systems or value systems. Okay, so when we talk about Goslin's work, he's going to be highlighting different functions within the institution of education. And one of the most important functions or the primary functions are manifest functions, right? It's those intended roles that schools should play. And so what I did is I took a screenshot of Corpus Christi Independent School District's About Us page, because it tells you what they intend to do with their with the students, right? So it says about CCISD, committed to developing hearts and minds. Corpus Christi Independent School District serves nearly 33,000 students at 56 campuses within 68 square miles. The district's mission, so that's right, that's that manifest function, is to graduate lifelong learners who are prepared to continue their education, enter the world of work, and be productive citizens. Since 1909, when the district was created, CCISD has served the community by focusing on excellence in pre-K through 12 education. So again, if you think of the three areas, they're very much in line with some of the functions that Goslin was highlighting in his reading, right? So prepare students to continue their education. So go on into higher education, enter the world of work, become workers, right? That's the economic sphere. Be productive citizens, polity, right? So it's like, how do you become a productive citizen? That has to be taught, right? And again, thinking about being a lifelong learner, our society is changing and we have to adapt to that. And so, again, Goslin says basically education has the capacity to help students unconsciously assimilate particular norms and values and worldviews, things that actually make us easier to integrate into less informal institutions, more formal institutions. So, it's really powerful when students are able to control their emotions, but actually in the way that, right, the broader society deems appropriate. How to deal with authority, how should we be interacting with people in positions of power, recognize hierarchies, right? So that's the other thing about acknowledging where your position is within an organization and accepting either the limitations or the expectations of what kind of power and authority you're going to have, and then what kind of power and authority others are going to have with you. This can be in your workspaces, but it can also be as citizens, right? And then how to solve problems. And our schools often focus on things like inductive or deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning goes back to the idea of taking specific examples, learning from those specific examples, and then creating these kind of generalizations based on these particular examples. And then deductive reasoning is basically going from theory, right, to hypothesis. So again, we have this kind of way of understanding how the world works, and then formulating some predictions about what you should see, right? And so when we look at schools and their intentionality around education, you can actually see that there are different ways of knowing and understanding that are privileged in our education system. And there are different disciplines that are valued and centered within our schools. And so, STEM is really big. Why is it really big? Again, we were thinking about, it's not about teaching the students and cultivating their knowledge based in their areas of interest. It's about what are the expectations and the demands of the broader society, and then developing a curriculum that meets those. And so, think about your own education going through the grade levels. All of us were required to participate in science fairs, right? And that participation in science fairs is a way of forcing students to think about the world through our senses and through like testable hypotheses, using systematic inquiry, right? And so there are different ways of knowing, understanding and being able to solve problems can be rooted in listening to people's oral histories and the folklore and legends that are passed down from generation to generation to generation. And we tend not to center, that kind of knowledge the way that we center scientific knowledge in our school systems, right? So again, what does that wind up doing? It winds up privileging knowledge that's generated by particular industries. and also like privileging their claims and the assumptions about the validity of their arguments compared to other ways of knowing and understanding. Okay, so Goslin says schools allow for this unconscious assimilation of these different elements that actually enable people to be able to integrate into other social institutions. He talks about the importance of schools supporting the discovery of new knowledge. And so I think this is something that's super important for you to take into consideration, that, you know, you guys in your education are learning things that are new to you. And so it feels like discovery, you know, but in actuality, you're learning specific stocks of knowledge, especially in grades K through 12, that orient us in a particular way. And, you know, there's a lot of knowledge and understanding and facts and theories about, you know, how the world works and why we exist and our relationships to one another. But what gets to be considered essential knowledge is something that groups of individuals is a decision that groups of individuals make that then orient and structure what we're actually going to learn in our schools. And so in order to support the discovery of new knowledge, students need to have foundational knowledge upon which, you know, more complex knowledge can be built, but also in such a way that primes students to be willing to continue to explore and learn new things and innovate and be okay with change. And so our schools, again, like that idea, like being lifelong learners, you know, is that notion that you don't stop learning and you don't stop exploring, and you need to be open to new things, you know, after you're done with your formal schooling. And all of this is designed to, they say, right, in their mission statement, to create these kind of lifelong learners and help students be able to adapt, you know, as our society changes. And so what I wanted to show you here is the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills that, or the page for Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills. And so you'll see here are all the content areas for the state of Texas. And then each subject matter is actually broken down by grade level. And so I'm just going to show you here the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills at the elementary school level, social studies, and then you've got kindergarten, right? And so they basically tell us what the goals are. Students practice problem solving, decision making, and independent thinking. To support the teaching of essential knowledge and skills, use a variety of rich materials encouraged. There are 8 strands of the essential knowledge and skills for social studies, right? What else can I show you? Oh, throughout social studies in kindergarten through grade 12. So again, the scaffolding of information, students will build a foundation in history, geography, economics, government, citizenship, culture, science, technology, and society and social studies skills. Right. And then it goes into all of those essential areas. And so there's the introduction. Here are some of the things that you are actually expected to learn in kindergarten. Right. And so teachers lesson plans are designed around these essential knowledge and skills. Right. Here's one in terms of thinking about that section, that position that he holds, fostering change and innovation, right? And so when we think about how do we solve our problems, how do we meet our needs, right here, see, describe how technology helps accomplish specific tasks and meet people's needs, describe how his or her life might be different without modern technology. So this is very much like oriented towards getting people to see that change produces positive outcomes. And in that kind of having that orientation, it's like, okay, what are the things that you have now? And what did people use before? And it's kind of going back to like some of those lessons are rooted in like the innovations make things more efficient, make more life more comfortable. And then that way that when there are new ideas being introduced or new technologies being introduced, we're not freaked out about it. We actually embrace it. Right. He also talks about how schools, one of their functions is allocating status positions. Remember when the previous lecture I talked about there being a hierarchy that exists in our society, from the elite all the way down to the poor, and how we allocate people to different statuses in our society. You know, education provides that space where that can happen. So people go to their schools and they're introduced to basically kind of a universal curriculum, especially in kindergarten, first, second, and third grade. There's goals about what students should be meeting, right, in those areas. So for example, with reading in grades K through 3, students are learning how to read. In grade 4, there's a shift where you practice your reading skills and you develop enough proficiency in reading that in grade 4, you start to read to learn, right? But in order to be able to read to learn, you have to learn to read first, right? So in the school system, they've got this curriculum, and then what that does is that universal curriculum gets taught to all of the kids in the class, and then kids will either shine or struggle. And then we'll see where students' aptitudes are or where their weaknesses are. And when they demonstrate aptitudes or weaknesses, then they get channeled into different paths. And so like the really bright kids are the kids who are really proficient in the curriculum that's designed for that class. They get celebrated, they get perks, they wind up being able to do a little task for the teacher. They get recommended to maybe do supplemental instruction or, you know, apply for the gifted and talented program, maybe do college prep courses, right? So that school setting allows us to see students' strengths and weaknesses and then develop those things. We're providing them with basic skills. So we're really getting into the training with the, let me go back over here, right? Not just values, but capacities, right? So when we talk about providing skills, it's teaching students particular skill sets, and then they demonstrate their capacities. And then where students are maybe not so strong, you know, teachers are there to be able to help them develop a skill set. And like when you think about the like STAR test, or maybe it was the TEKS if you went to school, or you know, for me I think it was a TOS test. Those tests allow us to the goal of using those tests is to basically make sure that students have some like baseline proficiencies at each of the grade levels. And then finally, schools are resources, especially in higher education, that are instruments that can transfer the prestige of the school onto the student. And so again, like, you know, this is a society of 330 million people. There are so many schools across the country. There may not even be like a standardization of curriculum in terms of what students learn, especially in college. You know, I made choices about what I'm going to teach you here. I mean, I do have an idea what you need to know as like maybe a sociology major. But you know, I have a lot of autonomy in my classroom. And so how do you know like what people learn, how proficient they are? Oftentimes what winds up happening is people use shortcuts and cues and markers. And so the prestige of institutions winds up being a really important resource for organizations when they're looking for workers, leaders. Yeah, so, you know, you could be a really good student who is sincere in learning and really embraces those opportunities, but people who are hiring are persuaded by the status of schools. So when schools are familiar, like UT Austin or A&M College Station or Harvard or Yale, right? Those schools have a history of organizational connections to power. They also have reputations of being really selective. And so people who go to those schools can benefit from the prestige of those institutions, which actually helps with the allocation process. Now, again, from a functionalist perspective, this helps to promote stability and predictability. It might be good for the society as a whole, maybe problematic for individuals, because we're not judged by what we can do. We're judged by our organizational affiliations. But so as individuals, it could be harmful, but from a functionalist perspective, this is a shortcut that we can use because there's just so much information in our society now. Goslin also talks about schools as being babysitters. And so this would be a latent function of schools. Remember, a latent function is a function that is not intended for the institution, but it's still an important function that the institution serves. So if you stop and you think about the mission statement for CCISD, I'm going to jump back, right? Committed to developing the hearts and minds, right? To graduate lifelong learners who are prepared to continue education, enter the world of work, and be productive citizens. Those are manifest functions. Those are intended functions. When we talk about babysitter, like in order to do that, we've got to have the kids in a classroom and then teaching them the different subject matter, right? There's a lot of subjects, right? There's a lot of subjects and a lot of capacities, commitments and capacities. And so it's going to take time to teach those kids. Well, as the argument was pushed that students needed more time in the classroom to learn important skills, that freed up more time for specifically women while their kids were at school. And then what that did was enabled those moms to then become engaged in other aspects of our society. Lots of them wound up going to work. Some of them would donate time to their, to the schools or to organizations, do volunteer work, right? And so the school would not embrace the idea that they're just babysitters, right? But it winds up being an expectation that families have, that I can send my kid to school and for the most part, they're going to be safe. They're going to be engaged in productive activities. They're going to be supervised. And then I can go and be a part of other aspects of our society, knowing that my kid's okay. And I think COVID did a really good, well, this is terrible. COVID was horrible, but you can actually see that function of babysitter and the importance of its role in the data that came out of what happened when the pandemic broke out. And so I just took some, screenshots of the U.S. Department of Labor's blog, and it's right, this piece of 5 facts on moms, work, and COVID. So when we first shut down with COVID back in 2020, right, schools had to close again because you had lots of people congregating in a relatively small space. And basically the BLS found that out of work mothers ages 25 to 44 were nearly 3 times as likely as out of work dads to cite COVID-related childcare issues as a reason they weren't employed, right? So childcare is a really important need for workers. And while it's an important need for men and women, and we see more men involved in the caregiving roles in their families, the reality is that women are still doing more of that labor. And so when we shut down schools, we made it really hard for people to work. And because the caregiving role is associated with women, mothers, we see that they were much more likely to be impacted by the closing of schools. Right. It says maternal employment took a hit due to school and daycare closures. Moms left the workforce more than dads. The younger the age of the child, the more likely a greater percentage of the workforce actually had to leave. So this goes back to the amount of caregiving and supervision, because a lot of our schools actually try to go online and deliver education and curriculum via the internet. But the younger the child was, the more supervision they would need to actually navigate those things. And again, gender roles are real. And we saw that women were much more likely to have to assume those roles. And the younger their children were, the more time intensive it was to take care of them. And so they were disproportionately affected in terms of having to leave the workforce. The older kids are more independent, still problematic, right? But parents, one, could leave kids at home by themselves, ages 13 to 17, or let them do their own thing as they navigated the online courses, and then letting parents being able to do their own work too. Another latent function of schools is courtship. Goslin talks about how schools are places where kids get to practice their adult roles, which also includes coupling. And this becomes particularly important when our schools are organized around age, because then kids are going through school together at relatively similar ages. They're going through puberty together. They're spending significant portions of their time together. There's one teacher in elementary school to 25 students, maybe, it's less than 22 prior to fourth grade. And then the ratio goes up, but, in high school, you can have students where it's, 30, 40 kids in a classroom to one teacher. And then, there's that space and time where students are doing work and then they're doing other things. And so you wind up meeting your crushes. Girls especially engage in practicing romance culture, and schools are in those spaces where they can talk about those things and share that information. And so a lot of us actually wind up meeting our significant others at school. And so courtship is a latent function of our schooling system. Goslin also talks about schools being a maintainer of subgroup traditions. And he mentions how racial and ethnic groups had pushed for curriculum that tell the story of the minority groups. And so I just have some examples here, the African-American studies, Mexican-American studies. And there has been some resistance towards those types of curriculum in public education, again, because when we look at grades K through 12, it's about creating a shared historical narrative, a shared idea of what it means to be a citizen. And while there are groups that are trying to push for having their culture and their values and their literature reflected in the curriculum, the dominant culture also has values and literature reflected in the curriculum, ways of knowing reflected in the curriculum. And so there's some groups have been able to mobilize to make sure that that curriculum is there in order to maintain and cultivate those traditions. Private schools, religious institutions teach their religious values. I have this picture of Incarnate Word Academy, really great school here in private school in the community. Have great placements for colleges, but notice excellence in Catholic education. So if you go to the school, you will be exposed to Catholic teachings and expect to learn those, right? And it's an important maintainer of subgroup traditions, but our schools are also play really critical roles in developing identities and maintaining traditions. But they're at that national level, that national identity. So I just wanted to show you a couple of things from the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills that I had up earlier. So again, we're looking at the essential knowledge and skills for kindergartners. And here's the one for citizenship. The student understands important symbols, customs, and responsibilities that represent American beliefs and principles and contribute to our national identity, right? So very intentionally, our schools are organized in such a way to get children to think of themselves as American, right? That's a primary identity. And so it's basic, it's kindergarten. Identify United States flag. But we're Texas, so you got to know the Texas flag, right? Recite the Pledge of Allegiance. So here we are, we don't even understand the language, and we got little kindergartners that are reciting our allegiance to not just the United States, but also Texas, which also makes sense why, you know, we like have all of this paraphernalia that's associated with Texas. Right? Even like rings and waffles of the shape of Texas, right? Like, why are you guys so full of yourselves? Well, because it starts in our essential knowledge and skills in kindergarten that we're going to be celebrating our statehood and our identity as a member of the state. Voting as a method of group decision making. And so even that voting right in the kindergarten level is like, we know that we're going to be part of this electoral process. Our understanding of voting gets a little bit more sophisticated as we get older, but you know, even that's like there's a particular way that we elect our leadership, right? And so this, again, conscious orientation around transmitting specific values and norms that fosters and maintains the development of traditions and identity. Okay. And then finally, Goslin's work actually talks about how schools can be a really important space for social reform. And that is, I mean, he talks about the integration of schools addressing segregation and basically like white supremacy, that in order to tackle that in the 1950s and the 1960s, integrating schools was a solution to try to help bridge the gap, the wide social distance between blacks and whites. And so, you know, he talks a little bit about that. But I also want you to think about it in terms of, you know, the structure of our schools. Like, why would integrating our schools be really important to challenging segregation, generally speaking? Part of it stems from the fact that our schools are organized in such a way where kids are brought together from a local neighborhood school. They're all the same age. They're put into a classroom where they spend, you know, 6 to 7 hours a day interacting with one another. And their exposure to curriculum is a kind of a universal exposure to curriculum. So we're all equals. The big differentiation is between you and the teacher, right? And then there's some gender differentiation, but you get to show your skill set and you get to compete with yourself, but also that with your peers, when you're looking at like who gets A on a roll, who gets a B on a roll, who doesn't get on a B on a roll. You know, how are you doing on your reading and your AR tests, right? And so when we think about that social reform and trying to challenge segregation, having kids go to school with each other and learn together and spend the day together is a way of having kids together as equals, right? And so it's hard to imagine what life would be like if we were in exclusively Black and exclusively white and exclusively brown spaces. You know, so, you know, part of that's a function of our demographics today, but it's also a function of the way that we've tried to challenge those exclusively Black and white spaces. And so because kids spend so much time in school, and because kids are impressionable, and because the manifest function of schools is to learn, you know, what we expose our children to can have an impact on their behaviors. And so, you know, I just have a couple of examples here, like the Red Ribbon Week, kind of teaching kids, trying to teach kids not to use drugs, right? You know, the Stop Bullying campaign. You know, you have curriculum on when we were really concerned with AIDS, in the late 80s, early 90s, the curriculum in sex education in public schools started to teach about using condoms. When we were concerned about the change in sexual mores in our society, people mobilized in our communities to teach abstinence only, right? And so, again, very kind of intentional around trying to shape attitudes and behaviors that were connected to sexuality. And so even right now, there's been some issues with schools. Florida, like infamously, passed a bill around forbidding schools from teaching about families and identity that weren't cis heterosexual individuals, right? And so, that legislating around values is very much connected to these ideas that adults have about how people should live and what should be prioritized and what should be learned and what should not be learned, right? So Goslin's argument around schools being important areas for social reform, you can still see that manifesting it when you see how hotly contested certain curriculum can be seen as by certain segments of our society. Okay, I'll stop there. So again, when we think about Goslin's work, he introduces us to that tenet of structural functionalism that focuses on the interrelated nature of our education system. Interrelated nature of our social institutions, how our education is intimately tied to other social institutions like polity, economy, and family, that there are intended things for students to learn, essential knowledge and skills. There are intended functions of schools, right? Train students on commitments and capacities, but then there are also latent ones, really important roles that schools play that weren't necessarily intended when we look at like origination documents for our schools or the mission statements for our schools, right? Those latent functions, being a babysitter, being a space where courtship can happen, being a maintainer of subgroup traditions, and as a target for social reforms. Okay, all right, I'm going to stop there. We'll pick up with Talcott Parsons, and all right, have a good one.